There we go. We're live. All right. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Playa Unplugged. I'm Benny Scala, aka the Playa, and I'm really looking forward to this episode tonight. My guest is Mr. Gary Powers, who is the executive director and curator for the National Roller Derby Hall of Fame and Museum. Now, roller derby's been around for close to 100 years, hard to believe, but and at times has had enormous popularity throughout the United States. I loved it so much that it was Palm Sunday, 1970. I was all of 14 years old. I went to Madison Square Garden all by myself to catch my favorite team, the San Francisco Bay Bombers. And boy, do I have a story to tell about that night. But Gary, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Benny, for having me. It's always great to talk about roller derby, one of the great American unique sports entertainment things that ever happened in this country. And yeah, great to be here.
Excellent. So I guess the best place to begin is at the beginning. I don't think many people realize that the Derby has been around that long. When and how did it start?
Well, there was a sports promoter by the name of Leo Seltzer,
Okay.
who originally was up in Seattle, Washington State, Oregon, up in the Northwest. In the early 1930s, he moved his family to Chicago when he got the lease on an old warhorse building called the Chicago Coliseum, which had hosted many presidential conventions over the years. And he began promoting events in there. And during the Great Depression, I mean, some of the things that he was promoting were like walkathons and dance-a-thons. I mean, you have to remember that back in the day, people didn't have TVs.
Right.
And spending 25 cents was a lot of money to go do something. You could go to the movies for 5 cents, 10 cents.
Right.
So there was a movie called They Shoot Horses, Don't They? About the dance marathons. And that's what was really, really popular, dance marathons and walkathons and just things to get people out of the house to go out to live sports. And there was also, back at the time, the early 1930s, bike races were very popular. And bike races were skated or were performed on these giant tracks that were banked at about
Okay.
45-degree angles, and people loved them. And Leo Seltzer would get together with a lot of his promoting friends and sports writers in a restaurant in Chicago called Ricketts. And one night Leo had read this article in a magazine called the Literary Digest that said that more Americans roller skated than participated in any other kind of sport. And more women roller skated than men. So he was fascinated with this. And some of his friends said, I bet you can't come up with a sport that it's about roller skating. And of course, he was thinking about the bike races on the track and the marathon races. So he came up with this idea of something called the Transcontinental Roller Derby, where it was a team of one man and one woman. And they would start like at 12 noon in the afternoon and go up until midnight the same day. And people would come out and pay 25 cents to come to the Chicago Coliseum. And they would watch these skaters just traveling around the track. And there was a giant map of the United States on the wall of the arena. And skaters would travel from one part of the country, from the West Coast all the way to the East Coast, over a period of 30 days. And there were cots in the middle of the infield. So, the guy skater would come off the track and the woman would take over, and the guy would sleep on the cot or just rest on the cot for a couple of hours. And then when the woman would come off, and it continued all day long. And they had comedians there telling jokes, and they had live bands. And so the first Transcontinental Roller Derby debuted in 1935, August 13th, 1935, at the Chicago Coliseum. And again, it was a sensation. I mean, it was something new. And one of the things that really captivated Chicago was the fact that there were women athletes. 100 years ago, women athletes, there weren't too many of them around. And people were just intrigued by the fact that here were these women that were basically skating in a sporting event, and they were playing by exact same rules as the men. So the first derby was very successful. Leo Seltzer took it around the country. He went to Kansas City. He took it to Louisville. He took it around the Midwest, and the nation was really intrigued with this idea, this new sporting event, which was invented by an American, and it also had women involved. And they also noticed that a lot of times when the skaters would collide into each other, or there was a little bit of body contact, the fans went wild. So now there was this famous sports writer in New York City by the name of Damon Runyon,
Okay.
and Damon Runyon was one of the first sports writers that, um, when he wrote about a sporting event, it wasn't just about, he didn't talk about the scores or the players or anything. He described what was going on in the arena, like the 300-pound woman with two fat kids next to her eating cotton candy, or this person, and he described it, and it was a really different type of writing, something that sports writers had never seen. And in fact, nowadays that type of writing is called it's Runyonesque writing. And Damon Runyon, of course, was famous because he wrote a bunch of stories, not only about sports, but he also wrote a story that was turned into the musical Guys and Dolls on Broadway. So it was these, and Damon Runyon became fascinated with the roller derby. He just thought the roller derby was the coolest thing. He saw it in Miami, Florida, in January 1936, about 5 months after the derby had started. And he brought it to New York, and he really promoted it within the sports community, because a lot of the sports writers, because women were involved, didn't really take roller derby very seriously. They thought, how serious can they be? Women are involved. I mean, come on. But it was the women that were selling all the tickets to the sport also. And so the derby went on, and it Damon Runyon basically said, you should create a sport, Leo Seltzer, that isn't just a man and a woman on a team, but you should have a team with 5 men and 5 women competing against another team of 5 men and 5 women. And that's how the modern version of roller derby came about. And it developed over and was cultivated over a number of years, but usually around the early 1940s, the modern version of roller derby came, where it was, two teams, skating against each other. The men would skate against the men, the women would skate against the women. Um, Sometimes, depending who got injured, sometimes the women ended up skating against the men. Sometimes the men skated against the women. Um, and roller derby was popular around the country. Leo Seltzer, though, was very frustrated because he could never make it work in New York City. And back in that time, uh, if you didn't make it in New York City, you didn't make it. So the first roller derby happened in New York City in September 1936. Damon Runyon was one of the producers or promoters of it. Didn't do very well. The city didn't really pay attention to it. 1946, August 1946, it ended up at the Polo Grounds in New York City, the home of
Oh yeah.
Major League
Giants. Yeah.
Baseball's New York Giants. It was the first time roller derby was ever televised on TV, but there was a lot of rain in New York City that summer in August, so the game again wasn't very successful. But they brought the sport. Leo Seltzer brought the sport back into New York City right after Thanksgiving, 1948. CBS television decided that they would show some of the games, and the very first night there weren't many people in, so Leo Seltzer had everybody sit on one side of the arena, and he told the cameraman, just show that one side of the arena. And it was on TV, and the next day the box office was just bombarded with people trying to get tickets to this thing.
Wow.
Something about being on TV, it was almost hypnotic in a way, watching it on TV. Um, So within a few years, roller derby had its headquarters in New York City, located at Madison Square Garden. It played the first World Series in 1949 in Madison Square Garden. Over 5 nights, sold out every night. Roller derby at that point was on TV 3 nights a week. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday night on TV, primetime TV. This was in the old days TV when not many people had TVs. And when you turned on the TV in the middle of the afternoon, it was just an Indian head on there.
I
There was no
remember.
no
Yep.
programming during the day. Programming didn't start till about 6 o'clock at night, and it only went on till about 11 o'clock at night. There were 3 channels, and television people were always looking for things that would take up a lot of time and space, like baseball. But of course, baseball, there weren't a lot of night games, so there weren't a lot of baseball games on TV at night. But the roller derby was on, like the Metropolitan Opera was on, the circus was on, those kind of,
Wrestling too.
and wrestling too,
Yeah.
absolutely. And again, roller derby, very much like wrestling, uh, changed the way society looked at women. They all of a sudden, Leo Seltzer didn't know it, but he was a women's libber way ahead of his time. Um, People watched female athletes and playing by the same rules as men, and they, all of a sudden, society started thinking, oh, because back in that day, it was women, got out of high school, they got married, they kept the house going, they raised the family, they were the people that just kept the house together. And all of a sudden, here were these female athletes, somebody like Midge Tuffy Brassoon, who everybody in the country knew Midge Tuffy Brassoon, another female skater by the name of Jerry Murray, and here were these women. And the fact of the matter is, in the early days of roller derby in the 1940s and 50s, it was the women's game that was the most important thing. And roller derby, because of its morality play elements, it it really helped a lot of people. I always say that women who were in bad marriages, bad circumstances, would go to the roller derby, scream and shout for 3 hours, and then go home and not put the knife in their husband's chest. You know,
That's
but it just, roller derby was always way ahead of its time. I mean, women were involved. There were a lot of gay people, not out, of course, but gay people in roller derby. Not only women, but men. People of color. I mean, roller derby had people of color in it before Major League Baseball. It was a real family affair, and everybody was included. And but that whole element of, like, good versus evil, like was in professional wrestling,
right.
was so inspiring and filled so many people with hope, because no matter what you were going through in your life, if you were some little effeminate kid in grade school, and people were beating you up, you'd watch roller derby on TV, and you'd identify with the good guys. And no matter what were happening to the good guys, they were getting the crap beaten out of them, and they always figured out a way to win. And that was inspiring to people of color, to gay people, to women, to Latinos. Um, so roller derby played a very, very important part in, I feel like, the development of who we are as
Yeah.
America today.
That's a great story. So you started saying about the 5 men and 5 women. Tell everybody about the premise, the structure of the game. How many periods? How many minutes? What are the positions? And what is the actual objective of the game?
Well, the game changed over the years. I mean, back in the 1950s, the periods, there were 8 periods in a game. The women would start the game. Sometimes in the 1950s, the men would start the game. There would be a period of 20 minutes. The idea of the game is 5 skaters from each team on the track. There would be the start of a jam, and the jams in the beginning would go about 2 minutes. Eventually, they went down to a minute and a half. They eventually, in the 1960s and 70s, went down to 1 minute as the skaters became much, much faster. But during the jam, um, there would be originally there were not different positions. Anybody could start a jam and try to score by lapping the pack. So they would leave the pack of skaters. They would try to come up to the back of the pack and pass skaters from the opposing team. And for every
Okay.
skater they pass, they would get a point. Now, in the 1960s, in the early 1960s, they decided that there would be, in the five skaters, there would be two jammers who would be the scorers. There would be two blockers who would be the people on defense. And then there would be one skater who was a pivot skater, usually the best skater on the team. And that skater could either block or jam. For instance, so the pivot skater was like a third jammer or a third scorer. And so within the one great thing about roller derby, it was always called a very simple game because you could watch roller derby and within a couple of minutes you knew exactly what the premise of the game was. I mean, the clock would start, these jammers would start at the back of the pack, make their way through the pack, come around the track and try to lap opposing skaters, and for every opposing skater they lapped, they would get a point. But of course, the skaters they were trying to pass were also trying to block them out and keep them from scoring. So somebody like Ronnie Robinson, Sugar Ray Robinson's son, he would use leg blocks, lift his leg up to stop somebody. They did jump blocks where they'd actually jump in the, from roller skates up in the air and block somebody with their entire bodies. Some skaters would get together with, put their arms together and
Clothesline.
clothesline. Yeah, yeah. But it was, again, by the late 1940s, as I said, and the early 50s, roller derby was the biggest thing in the country. I mean, the skaters were on every national magazine and every newspaper, on television programs. And then roller derby was one of the first sports that was overexposed on TV. And the funny thing was, it didn't really happen to wrestling. I'm not quite sure why. But people, as they got TVs, more and more people got TVs, they thought, well, why should we go out to the arena and watch it in person when we can just watch it from our home on TV? So roller derby was over. It was on 3 nights a week on TV. It was on all the time, and Leo Seltzer couldn't really get a good contract with the major networks, and he got frustrated and just to say, you know what? I'm leaving. I'm leaving New York City. We're moving out of New York City. He moved everything to the West Coast in 1954 to Los Angeles. By the end of the 1950s, his son took over. His son, Jerry Seltzer, took over the sport. And Jerry Seltzer was a really incredible promoter and entrepreneur. At one point, he was going to buy the Oakland Seals NHL hockey team.
Okay.
But Jerry really understood marketing, and he would film all these games, videotape all these games, and send tapes all around the country to all these different TV stations. He had a market of like 120 TV stations, and basically every broadcast of roller derby was like a commercial for the national tour. So the skaters would skate in San Francisco, the Bay Area, from May until September, and then they would go on the road and they'd go all around the country. And the roller derby national tour became so huge. I mean, it sold out every single arena in the country. And promoters, people that own these buildings, loved roller derby because they said, we never see these people show up for roller derby that they don't come to anything else. We have no idea where these people come from, you know? And the roller derby tour became so huge. The San Francisco Bay Bombers were out on tour against the roller derby all-stars. It became so huge that in 1969, they broke the San Francisco Bay Bombers up into two teams, San Francisco and Oakland. They put the big star of the Bay Bombers, Charlie O'Connell, on the San Francisco team. They put the big female star, Joan Weston, on the Oakland team. So it was almost like what Ringling Brothers did. Ringling Brothers became so huge, the circus, they turned them into the red unit and the blue unit. And that's what happened with roller derby too. So The Oakland Bay Bombers could be in, Dallas, Texas, skating the Northeast Braves, while the San Francisco Bay Bombers were up in New York City skating the Midwest Pioneers or something like that.
Wow, interesting.
And again, it's where all the money was made on the tour.
Sure.
But imagine how grueling it was, especially in the winters, January, February, March, and April, traveling around the Northeast in the snow, going from town to town. It was like this,
Sure.
skaters in their cars just traveling from town to town to get to, skate these games in front of people that came from nowhere to see them. So,
Yeah. Well, I wrote a story for the pro wrestling. I do a lot of writing for professional wrestling, and I
right,
wrote a story for the Pro Wrestling Stories website, but it was called Roller Derby Wrestling on Wheels. And so I tried to, draw some similarities between the two. Yeah.
right.
Is it fair to say that roller derby was like wrestling in that it was for the most part kind of scripted, but with a lot of athleticism?
Absolutely. The skaters, one of the worst things that anybody could say, especially I heard this so often when I was young, man, people would find out that I was a big roller derby fan. They'd say, "Oh, that's so fake. That's phony." And but the thing about roller derby was these were exceptional athletes.
Right.
I mean, these were like professional wrestlers. I mean, they were so well trained and so skilled, and they could do all this stuff on roller skates, you know, on roller skates. But it was, as the skaters called it was worked in a sense that they had certain plays they knew they could do. Um, and if they went into an arena like in Fayetteville, North Carolina, or something, and the crowd really wasn't into it, or the crowd was a little quiet. They knew exactly what they needed to do, like good stage performers, get the crowd involved. Um, so yeah, but but the wonderful thing about roller derby was you never were. It was like, okay, is this legit? Or sometimes you'd think, I don't know, maybe it's a little on the, it's being skewered a little bit, but they were so gifted. And the idea was that they never let the public in on the fact that
Right.
it was worked.
There's a wrestling term called kayfabe, which is
Yes.
protect the business. Don't let anybody outside the business know that it is a work. But I the other day I saw my beloved Yankees lose 17-5 to the Orioles,
I was watching.
and I go back to when I watched the Derby, and it seemed that it was always there was never a romp like that in the Derby. It always seemed like a 1 or 2 point game decided in the very last second. But the way they did it was unbelievable. It was so good.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, years ago, there was always this thing where Leo Seltzer really believed that it could be a totally legitimate sport, that it would be all played on the up and up. But they found out when a game ended and the score was 60-18, the fans, they weren't as involved as, so they found that whole idea of a little bit of color and a little bit of theatricality, that's what the fans wanted. And when Jerry Seltzer, Leo's son, took over the Derby in 1959, the roller derby was situated in Los Angeles at the time, and most of the skaters, when you have male and female athletes together, a lot of them were married, and they had families and they had kids in school. And Jerry Seltzer lived in the Bay Area. He lived in San Francisco. He didn't want to live in LA. That's where his father was. So he moved the Derby to Northern California, to San Francisco. And a lot of the skaters, though, were left behind in Los Angeles, and they didn't want to uproot their families and go up north to the Bay Area. So they started a new league, which was called Roller Games, which was basically roller derby, but with a different name. And roller games, the most famous team was the Los Angeles Thunderbirds.
Okay.
Called the T-Birds, and roller games played all over the world. It played in Australia. I mean, it had leagues in Australia, a league in Japan. It had a league in Canada. It skated in Mexico City, skated all over the world. But the roller games version, even though in the very beginning it was very much like the original roller derby, they decided that the fans in Los Angeles, I don't know, I sometimes think maybe it's because of Hollywood or, show business or what. The fans in LA really wanted a much, much more theatrical version of the game. So it became, you would have, somebody would go out on a jam, in the original roller derby, somebody go out on a jam and score 2 points or 3 points. If somebody scored 5 points a grand slam, that was a big thing. In roller games, sometimes people go out and they'd score 14, 15 points in one jam. The scores in roller games would sometimes be like 181 to 176, something like that.
Now, how could they do that, Gary? I mean, once they lap, could they go and do it again?
Yeah, they could continue
Oh,
lapping
all right, all right.
as long as the jam
Yeah, the time
time would
limit.
happen.
I
And of
got you.
course, the idea was you could always the skater who was scoring could always call off the jam by putting their hands on
Right.
their hips.
Yep.
And of course it became this joke in roller derby. Sometimes a skater would try to pull up their shorts, and call the jam off by mistake. But no, and roller games again was much more theatrical. They had like, they had a dwarf on the infield, and they had a lot of things which were, the roller derby purists, the ones who really wanted the game skated as legitimately as possible. That was just unheard of, to have like an infield dwarf or, you know, things, somebody would lose a match race. A match race was two skaters on the track skating just against each other, doing anything they could. And then the loser might have to take a bath on the infield, or might have to, get a pie in the face, or might have to have their beard shaved off or something. And that kind of stuff in the original derby.
That's very wrestling esque. Loser
Yeah,
leaves town. Loser gets their head shaved. Yeah, that kind of stuff.
exactly.
Wow. What you started mentioning about the tour. So one of my questions actually it fits right in. What was the lifestyle of a derby? Or I remember the derby. Like how long were they on tour? How many matches did they skate? Did they travel by car?
Well, the thing was, in the original derby, the one that Jerry Seltzer had in Northern California, if you were on the home team, the Bay Bombers, you skated from May until September, 6 nights a week. I mean, you usually had Monday off, and sometimes they didn't have Monday off, but they usually skated 6 nights a week in the Bay Area, selling out every game. I mean, it was roller derby outperformed every other sport in the Bay Area, even the San Francisco Giants. I mean, it was a huge thing. I mean, they would have these games at the Oakland Coliseum on July 4th, 1970. They had 34,000 people there.
Wow.
Um, they skated a game in Comiskey Park in Chicago in September 1972. They had over 50,000 people there. They skated at Shea Stadium in New York in 1973. I mean, they would pack arenas. They skated the Rose Bowl. But a skater on the Bay Bombers during the regular season would be skating 6 nights a week. Um, and then they'd usually have September, October off, and then they would have smaller tours in November, December. But then the big national tour usually started in January, went from January to April. And these were skaters in their car traveling around the country from city to city. Um, the biggest thing was getting their laundry done. you know, as
Right.
soon as they got to a town, it's like right to the laundromat to get the laundry done. And you'd skate before 10,000 people in some arena, and some of the skaters would make extra money by showing up early and putting up the track. So there was a track construction crew. They could make extra money that, and then the game was over, and of course they'd have to take the track down, put it in a truck. The truck will go off to the next city, and a lot of times they were skating 6, 7 nights a week, all over the country. you know.
Wow. So for 4 months, they're pretty much, going from town to town. And that,
Absolutely.
so was it, would they each take their own car? I know, like in wrestling, usually 4 or 5 guys in a car to kind of split the transportation cost.
Right. And that the same thing happened in the Derby too. A lot of skaters would be together. I mean, some of the bigger stars were like, "No, it's just me and the wife. Forget it." And somebody like Joan Weston, who was a really smart woman, probably the biggest star, the female star in Derby in the 60s and 70s. I mean, and she loved traveling around the country, and she always wanted to go to all these different sites, like the Grand Canyon, or we go to this place. And a lot of the younger skaters were just like, it's just a big hole in the ground. What do you want to go see that for? But I mean, imagine what it's like to, go from city to city and city, and skaters were treated like rock stars. They were huge. It was a big, big thing.
Now, Gary, so my memory, Joni Weston, uh, Charlie O'Connell, you got Ronnie Robinson, who else? You got Mike Gammon, and
Judy
what was his
McGuire,
wife's name? Was Judy
Judy
McGuire?
McGuire. Yep.
Yeah, Tony Rowland, Carol Peanuts Lowry. Did Bill Grohl, I guess it was.
Bill
What,
Grohl. Yep.
what kind of money did they make? The stars say.
Well, it was always reported that Charlie O'Connell was the highest paid skater in roller derby. He made over $50,000 a year, which
That's
again,
good money back then.
it was big money back then.
Yeah,
Absolutely. And one of the perks that Charlie had was that he had his own credit card that the company paid for. So anything he needed, the company paid for it. And Charlie also had a bar in the Bay Area. He hired a lot of skaters to work at the bar when they weren't on the track. And again, every week on the TV broadcast, they talked about Charlie's bar. So it was like an advertisement for his bar every week. So he was making a lot of money that way. Other skaters, the women, of course, were not generally paid as much. Joan Weston probably was the highest paid skater, making $35,000 a year. Calvello made about the same.
that's pretty healthy salary though back in the 60s, 70s.
Absolutely, absolutely. But again, just having these skaters, having them travel around the country the way they did, I mean, it was a hard life sometimes,
Yeah. Again, very wrestling in professional wrestling at that time, there were 30 territories around the country,
Right.
and even within a territory, there was one was called Mid South, which was Oklahoma, Arkansas, part of Texas, Louisiana, and these guys sometimes would have like they'd wrestle at 8, 9 at night, and then they'd get and hit the road because they had maybe a 6-hour drive to somewhere in Louisiana where they were going to wrestle the next day. So, very, very similar. But I did want to ask about you mentioned the IRDL was one of the International Roller Derby League, and then there was the roller games.
Right.
So I went to the Garden, I think I said Palm Sunday, 1970. I think at that time, that set an indoor record for attendance.
It did. Yep.
I think it was the Bombers and the Pioneers, if my memory serves me correctly. It was a long, long time ago.
Yep.
But my understanding is the IRDL didn't last much longer after that. How come that happened? Because they were doing so well.
Well, a lot of things. I mean, the game that you're talking about, March 22nd, 1970, did break a record. I mean, it was the largest indoor attendance of roller derby at the time, over 19,500 people at Madison Square Garden. And what we call the suits at Madison Square Garden were very interested in the roller derby at that time. And they made arrangements with Jerry Seltzer because at that time in the 1970s, I mean, roller derby was selling out every arena in the country. And the mainstream press, sports press, they just didn't understand it. They're like, how can this be it's the roller derby. I mean, come on. Frank DeFord, an incredible sports writer, His very first book was about the roller derby called Five Strides on the Bank Track, The Life and Times of the Roller Derby. And he went on the road with the roller derby and he just fell in love with it because originally Sports Illustrated wanted him to go on the road with the roller derby and expose it because they knew something was up. There was no way it could be that popular. And he went on the road with the roller derby and absolutely fell in love with it. Um, there was a gigantic spread in Sports Illustrated on March 3rd, 1969. Vince Lombardi on the cover, and there was a 8-page story by Frank DeFord about the roller derby. Made a lot of the regular sports people get really upset. Okay, but roller derby was so popular. The people at Madison Square Garden wanted their own team, so they started the New York Chiefs. They brought back the New York
Okay.
Chiefs in the fall of 1971. They totally reorganized the league. Charlie O'Connell, who had been with the San Francisco Bay Bombers from 1957 until 1971, went to the New York Chiefs, became the coach of the New York Chiefs. Um, Joan Weston went to the Midwest Pioneers, the Chicago Pioneers. She was the biggest name in the women's field. Calvello was with the Jolters team in Cincinnati. Um, but the thing was, there were a lot of things that happened in 1973. I mean, roller derby was still selling out everything. Jerry Seltzer had promoted this big championship game at Shea Stadium over Memorial Day, 1973. Um, and roller derby was always it was a family run business, like many of them are. And Jerry Seltzer really depended upon all of these promoters and people that he worked with that always take care of the roller derby because the roller derby was great for everybody. I mean, if you're selling out, some arena in Akron, Ohio, the arena is doing great, but just from selling concessions itself. So it's like, yeah, they want the roller derby there. Well, Jerry Seltzer did this big game at Shea Stadium in 1973. The tickets were being sold by Ticketmaster, and maybe a week before the game, he called up. He got the numbers. They had sold 20,000 tickets for the event. He called them a week later, like 2 days before the game, and they said, "Oh yeah, we've sold 20,000 tickets." And he said, "But that's how many you sold last week." And here he didn't know it, but the Ticketmaster system had been down for a week, and nobody even bothered to tell him. And he got really frustrated and disheartened by the way the roller derby was being treated. But he became very, very interested in ticket selling. And here was this man who was trying to make the roller derby run and really doing it all on his own, basically. And he didn't feel like he was getting a lot of support. And in the fall of 1973, there was a gasoline shortage, an oil crisis in the world. There wasn't enough
I
oil.
remember that. Oh yeah.
Yep, and there were big lines, and all of a sudden,
Yes, sir.
all these are big lines for gasoline. And all of a sudden, these arenas that always had welcomed the roller derby were like, we can't heat the building when you're here, and nobody's going to be able to get gas to come to see the games. So all of a sudden, it's like he wasn't selling any tickets, but he was very interested in the ticketing business. So in beginning of December 1973, he decided to close down the family business, which was a very, very difficult thing for him. And he ended up selling everything to roller games out of Southern California. Um, Jerry Seltzer then went into the ticketing business. He created something called the Bass Tickets in Northern California, which was eventually bought out by Ticketron, and Jerry Seltzer became an executive at Ticketmaster. Um, the so anyway, when he sold the original roller derby, and they combined roller derby and roller games together, it was supposedly a merger, but really what it was roller games just continued. And the derby fans who were the purist who wanted the sport skated as legitimately as possible, they just couldn't accept roller games. And the roller games fans, all of a sudden, the team that was always there, 46 weeks a year, their team was off skating in Los Angeles somewhere. So the whole thing just fell apart, and nobody was happy, and it fell apart like within 2 years, it was gone. Everything was gone.
Wow. So you mentioned Charlie O'Connell being with the Bombers for 15 seasons. How did that work? Were there contracts, like annual contracts, so they couldn't jump teams? Did they ever trade players?
Well, there were always trades, but again, one of the things, fans of the sport are constantly asking, how could this thing that was selling out every arena in the country in the early 70s, 34,000 people in the Oakland Coliseum Stadium, 50,000 people at Comiskey, how could it end? But the truth of the matter was, every team, every skater was owned by the Seltzer family. So, of course, if the Bay Bombers had been owned by somebody, and the Pioneers had been owned by somebody, and the Chiefs had been, and if one of these people decided they didn't want to do it anymore, everybody else would have jumped in, like in any other sport. That wasn't the case in roller derby because Jerry Seltzer owned everything.
Right.
And after him, Bill Griffith with roller games owned everything. So, yeah, there were trades, but listen, sometimes in roller derby, there were trades made for, not the usual reasons. Like there might be two girls that were on one team having an affair with each other, and all of a sudden they broke up. It's like, we got to trade her. Yeah, we got to trade her to that other team,
Right.
Charlie O'Connell, when he came to the Bay Bombers, was romantically involved for 3 years with Ann Calvello. And they were both white shirt, stars of the Derby, stars of the Bay Bombers, the most popular skaters on the Bay Bombers. And after they broke up, Charlie O'Connell basically went to Jerry Seltzer and said, listen, you can either have me on the team or you can have Calvello on the team. You can't have us both. So they sent Calvello off packing. And of course, she became one of the greatest, what you'd call in wrestling, heels in the business.
A heel, right.
Yeah, she became, she was upset, of course, because, here I'm the big star of the Bay Bombers, a big female star, and they're getting rid of me. But in a way, it was like the best thing that ever happened to her in her career, because now she traveled. She was, after Tuffy Bursoon, the most famous female red shirt in the history of the game.
Right. Did they actually keep stats? Like I know that I think Mike Gammon was like a rookie of the year. Charlie O'Connell won the MVP award. Did they keep stats on the points at all?
They did, but it wasn't like
Major League Baseball.
Yeah, it wasn't like other sports. I mean, they did keep the stats, but it wasn't anything that anybody was, it's not like, I mean, I'm a huge baseball fan. I mean, I subscribe to MLB Network. Yeah, I mean, I watched every game the Yankees are. In fact, the Yankees are on right now playing the Mets.
Yeah.
But no, it's not like baseball where people can, we've become huge hockey fans out here too in Southern California. We have a brand new hockey team that this past Monday lost the Calder Cup, the AHL, to the Hershey Bears. But again, hockey and those other sports, they kept precise records. They didn't really do that in roller derby because, again, fans, they didn't really care about, like scores or, it's
not even like one-loss records for the teams.
No. And here's the thing, okay? A lot of times it'd be like, in the early 70s, there'd be like 4 teams in the league, in the roller derby league, 4 teams in the league. And then it would come playoff time, and all 4 teams would be in the playoffs because, it's like
you need 4 teams to have a good playoff.
Yeah, but I mean, what was the regular season about? Most professional sports league, it's about getting the best record, so you're in the playoffs. But the Midwest Pioneers could have lost every single game that they skated, and they'd still be in the playoffs. So that kind of stuff didn't really,
Yeah,
it didn't matter a whole lot to the roller derby
right.
fans.
Would it be safe to say, like I remember growing up in New York, I think it was Lindsey Nelson broadcast Notre Dame highlights. I'd see him every Saturday, Sunday, I think it actually was. Um, so to me, like Notre Dame was America's team as far as college. Would it be safe to say that the Bombers were America's team as far as the Derby?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I
And
mean,
when they toured, were they typically the favorites?
oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it, because the truth of the matter is the fans, they were watching the Bay Bombers on TV every week. So when the Bay Bombers came to town, I mean, that's who they were there to cheer for. The Bay Bomber, and the Bay Bombers were so huge that they could split them up into two teams, one from San Francisco, one from Oakland.
Right.
Um, and people didn't care. They just wanted to see the Bay Bombers.
Yeah. Yeah, no, brings back a lot of memories. So, Gary, where is the museum?
The museum right now is in storage.
Okay, I was going to ask if it's open to the public, but
Well, it will be open to the public very shortly. The
okay,
the museum in my relationship with when I was a 12-year-old kid, and I was obsessed with roller derby. I mean, I couldn't get enough of it. I mean, I was just obsessed with roller derby. Um, when I was about to turn 12, my father died very suddenly.
oh
I
my
was
gosh,
12-year-old kid. My father drops dead
wow,
one day. And of course, it was devastating. And I was not the happiest little kid, little 12-year-old. And I was so devastated by the loss of him that I would think, like, Monday would come and I would be like, I'm going to kill myself. I was so unhappy, I mean, and, and nobody was talking about it. I was just left alone. But then I would think, I can't kill myself because Ann Calvello and the Midwest Pioneers are coming to town this weekend.
got to hold that off for a little bit.
Yeah. So, and I feel really like these skaters in many ways saved my life as a kid because I was obsessed. I mean, can you imagine me watching Ann Calvello on TV every week and then later in life spending the night at her house and having Ann Calvello knock on the door of the bedroom and bring me coffee in the morning?
Wow,
Like, how did that happen? Or have Mike Gammon come to my house, or have lunch with Judy McGuire and Charlie O'Connell in Palm Springs, or
unreal.
so I feel so indebted to these people. Like, I mean, anything that I can do to celebrate their accomplishments, I mean, it's an honor. It really is an honor. I had lunch in California this past weekend with a famous roller derby skater. We did an event in Los Angeles last September to celebrate these skaters. So the thing was, in 2000, when I became friends with Calvello, Ann Calvello was a rock star. I mean, she couldn't go anywhere without being recognized by people. And when I met Ann Calvello in the late 1990s, she was cleaning toilets in a hospital. I mean, and bagging groceries. And so I started something at the time called the Roller Derby Foundation, and I basically began raising money for former skaters by selling videotapes of games, selling programs, anything I could get my hands on that I could sell. And all the money went to these skaters. I mean, even things like just sending people phone cards, so they could pick up the phone and talk to each other. Or if they wanted to go somewhere, I paid people's rent. I paid Calvello's rent for a long, long time.
That's very similar to the Cauliflower Alley Club for professional wrestling.
Yeah,
Same
yeah,
kind of things.
yeah. Well, it's that thing where there was no union for these skaters. They didn't get anything. And I saw people trying to make money off of their accomplishments. And I thought, well, why should you be making money off them? They're the ones who were these incredible athletes. So we did the Roller Derby Foundation. That went on, and we brought people together around the country, fans and skaters. We did events in Chicago, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, New York City, all around the country, in Des Moines, Iowa. bringing skaters and fans together. And you know how it is when you get a bunch of wrestling fans together with wrestlers. They all talk the same language, you know.
Absolutely.
You don't have to explain anything. It's
Nope.
like, you know, and so anyway, we did that, the Roller Derby Foundation in 2000. 2004, I asked Jerry Seltzer if I could reopen the Roller Derby Hall of Fame, because it had the original Roller Derby Hall of Fame opened in 1952. It had been at Madison Square Garden for some time. And then when the Derby closed in 1973, the Hall of Fame closed. So we reopened the Roller Derby Hall of Fame in 2004, so that we, like people like Mike Gammon and Joan Weston and Judy McGuire, they were not in the Hall of Fame. I mean, these incredible, iconic people, athletes. So we inducted them into the Hall of Fame. And we made a distinction. So it wasn't about, you know, just the Derby. It was also roller games. We also opened up wings to wings for the announcers, for executives, for referees, for writers. Damon Runyon is in the Hall of Fame now. But again, it's all about celebrating the accomplishments of these people, and they were just phenomenal athletes. And that's what it's all about. So anyway, the Roller Derby Hall of Fame was in Brooklyn for the first 10 years. And then 9 years ago, I moved to Southern California, and I was in the process of finding a place for the Hall of Fame to reopen, because we have the largest collection of roller derby memorabilia in the world. We have over 200 jerseys. We have over 700 programs. We have pennants. We have all kinds of things, history. And skaters donate things to me all the time. And so we were trying to find a place out here in California, and then the pandemic hit. So I have recently taken over a brand new space here in Palm Springs. I've opened up a theater company called the Revolution Stage Company, and we will be not only presenting a musical called Roller Derby the Musical,
Oh, wow.
but we'll also be showcasing the Roller Derby collection here in Palm Springs. So that'll be happening sometime this fall.
That's excellent.
Thank you.
You just mentioned announcers. Now, the guy I remember is Walt Harris, and I believe Walt Harris also did announcing for I believe Roy Shire in San Francisco.
He did. Yeah.
Great announcer.
Walt Harris was perfect for the roller derby because he was in awe of the skaters. I mean, he was again, he had watched professional wrestling, he had called professional wrestling for a long time, was in awe of those athletes. And again, you know, the bottom line, I mean, skaters always say to me how much it touches them when I call them athletes, because you know, you somehow forget about, you know, these are great performers out there, whether in the ring or on the track, and you sometimes forget about all the hard work that goes into being a really conditioned, fine athlete. I mean, I look at some of these wrestlers. I mean, I'm like blown away by, you know, what they must do to keep in shape and to do what they do. I mean, it's just mind blowing.
Well, and especially like back in the 70s. So my hero was Bruno Sammartino, of course, because I'm Italian and I grew up in New York. But, you know, Bruno would wrestle routinely like 300 times a year. And many of his matches were 60-minute draws. I mean, to wrestle, I mean, they didn't really move around fast like they do now. I mean, now they're more acrobats than actually wrestlers. But you know, you're wrestling a 400-pound guy like Gorilla Monsoon. There is a lot of physicality, and I mean, to do that for an hour, that takes a lot of conditioning.
Well, I was a big fan of Bruno Sammartino too as a kid. I mean, George the Animal Steele was the best. The Professor Tanaka
with the salt.
Oh, it was just, you know. And then I remember going down into Florida in the early 70s and seeing Dusty Rhodes, you know, wrestle. And I mean, these were like phenomenal athletes. I mean, I sometimes think they don't get enough credit for, you know, people just sort of, of course you have to be in shape and you have to, but I mean, That's a lot of hard work.
Well, and I think there's another similarity to roller derby in that, back in the day before cable, all you had was, when you had the territories, you had your local TV show,
Yeah.
and then you had your interviews. And, Ray Morgan, who was the announcer for back in the early or late 60s, I think he actually dated back to the late 50s through about 1970. And he'd have these interviews, and Bruno usually did not wrestle on TV, but he'd bring Bruno on for a minute or two, and
Yep.
Bruno would talk about the Garden that that month. And guess what? I think Bruno sold out the Garden 188 times in his career.
Yeah.
They just had a formula. They knew what to do. And these guys don't really get enough credit. They've never got enough credit as the showmen that they were, because they really made you believe that you were watching a fight.
Well, I mean, like I said, as a kid, George the Animal Steel.
He was scary.
I mean, he was brilliant. It was like he knew. And then later I would read about him in real life, and I was like, wow.
Very smart man, right? He had a master's degree.
Yeah. But I think that, and I always say, listen, I think in the world we live in nowadays, we need more of these morality plays. We need to see more of the good guys, and because in the world we live in nowadays, it seems like a lot of the bad guys never get their comeuppance. I don't. They get pardoned or whatever. You know what I mean? It's like we need the good guys, and I think especially little kids need to see this idea that no matter what's going on in your life, if you're a good person and you do right, you're gonna succeed and you're gonna win. You know.
No, you really nailed it, because one of my there's a wrestling movie. It's a documentary, and one of the gentlemen in the movie, his name was Howard Jerome. He played a German heel back in the 60s, but he said something that has stuck with me, like for the number of years since I saw that movie. And he said, there is a fundamental longing in the human heart to see good triumph over evil.
Absolutely.
And I think that's what roller derby was built on, and that's what wrestling was built on back in the 60s and 70s. But now the lines have become very blurred.
Right.
You'll have a guy who's a heel that people will cheer for. You'll have a baby face that they'll start saying boring. There's no longer that you don't identify with your hero anymore. You're more likely, you're just as likely to identify with a heel, a bad guy. And I think I would like to see it more back to the way it was, where somebody that stood for good and virtue, like Bob Backlund back in the days. Bob Backlund, I think if he started wrestling 10 years ago, he never would have made it. They would have just, they would have booed him out of the arena.
Yeah. No, I think what you're saying is so important, and I really do believe, I mean, I think kids today, they really need heroes. It's like if you said to somebody today, who are your heroes? I'm not sure who they would say, because it's become really muddied and it's not as clear as it is. And listen, I'm one of these people that it's like, I don't believe life is all black or white. I mean, I think, there's a lot of stuff that's in the gray areas, and we're all human beings. We're not perfect. We all screw up. We all make mistakes. But I also think that idea of having people that you can aspire to be, that are really good people, and showing you that just by being a good person, you're going to succeed. I think that's a really important message that's lacking today.
Well, last question. So will we ever see a resurgence of the Derby to the level that we saw it back in the 70s?
People hate it when I say it, but I don't believe it's going to happen.
I agree with you. I'm kind of sad that you said that, but I believe the same thing. And it really, I would love to see it make a comeback.
I would too. I loved the sport. I mean, there was nothing better than me to be in an arena and hear those wheels on a track going around. It was like magical. But I think roller derby came at a magical time in American history, with the advent of television and women being in the sport competing by the same rules as men. I just think it was a special, special time, and I'm afraid I just, it's funny because sometimes people say, if I ever win the lottery, I'm bringing back the roller derby, and I think to myself, man, you're just going to lose a lot of money.
Yeah. It's funny, and we just touched on this. And you mentioned Professor Tanaka.
Yeah.
My first card was I think April 26th, 1968, at the Island Gardens in West Hempstead, and it was Bruno versus Tanaka. And at the end of the match, they collided in mid-ring. It sounded and felt like an earthquake. And here I am thinking, oh no, Professor Tanaka, he's going to get up. He's going to get up at 10, and Bruno's going to lose. And of course, Bruno got up at 9 7/8, and so my world was safe for the time being. But I went there thinking that people were going to fight, and I think now people go to they go to any place. I'm close to Amalie Arena. They don't go there thinking that. They go there thinking, well, I'm going to get entertained tonight, and it's a huge difference.
Yep, absolutely. Well, we can, I'm not one of those that thinks it's ever going to come back, but really for the rest of my life, I'll just always celebrate these incredible athletes and what they accomplished. And I'll make sure that on some level, they're never going to be forgotten.
No, I totally agree. So folks, that's the final buzzer, and it's time for us to skate home. Gary, I cannot thank you enough. This was so much fun. And I learned so much about the Derby. I mean, I've loved the Derby for 55 years. So It was so good to hear that, somebody else who really, really knew what the Derby was all about. So thank you for that.
Thank you. And I have a lot of photos from that game, color photos from March 22nd, 1970.
Wow.
I'm going to send them to
you. I might be in one of them. Who knows? So, Gary, real quick, how do people find you on social media?
They can find me at www.rollerderbyhallofame.com. They can also, I wish I could say I'm one of these young kids on Instagram and all that stuff. I think I'm on Instagram, actually. But we also have a website, National Roller Derby Hall of Fame, on Facebook.
Okay. I think I've been on that. Yes. Yeah, and your Facebook page is very informative.
Thank you. Well, like I said, it's all about celebrating the accomplishments of these people. I mean, I can't believe these people I watched on TV are in my life, and anything I can do to celebrate them.
It's really funny you said that because, my birthday was on Monday, and, I'm getting a lot of wishes from my friends, and here I get an instant message, and it was from John Rodriguez, who is known in the wrestling world as the unpredictable Johnny Rods. And I'm thinking I've had a couple of chats with him on the phone over the years. He helped me do work on a couple of the stories I wrote. I'm thinking I used to watch you when I was 12 years old. And now you're on the phone with me telling me stories about Andre the Giant and Baron Cicluna and Bruno and Dominic DeNucci. It's surreal. I tell my friends, I pinch myself, but at my age, I'm afraid of clotting. But it will never get old. It is just, it's such a thrill. And I'm still in awe of these guys because of what they did. But so again, Gary, thank you, folks. Please hit the like button and subscribe to this great channel, and keep your eye out for the next episode of the Playa Unplugged. So for Gary Powers, the play is out, but I'll be back. There is no doubt. Good night, folks.
Thank you, Benny.
All right. And that's the wrap.
Excellent.